G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. Here's a dangerous idea for you. The institution that is best equipped to defeating Trumpism, to shoring up traditional anti-Trumpist American traditions of pluralism and tolerance, civility, reason, forgiveness, and of rescuing Western civilization from splitting apart into squabbling echo chambers of irrationalism, the institution best placed to do such things, to pull off the inevitable, to save us all, is the Evangelical Church that helped turbocharge Trump in the first place. And furthermore, the claim is that the people whom secular liberals like myself should form alliances with to save us all are white, conservative American evangelicals. Well, that's a claim that pricked my ears up, to say the least, as someone who generally thinks of institutionalized religion as being part of the problem, not the solution to most of what ails us in the West. But when the man making the case is a man as wise as Jonathan Rauch, I listen. He has a new book, Jonathan. It is entitled Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. And I first invited Jonathan on the show many months ago, actually, when I was thinking about the people who I wanted to speak to around inauguration time, because I thought he would be fascinating to hear opine about Trump 2.0 and what we might expect the impact of a second Trump term to be on America's institutions, on the institutions of liberalism, on American tolerance and pluralism and diversity. Jonathan is an expert, if you don't know him, he's a journalist, but basically an expert thinker in how we can all get along and how the institutions of American democracy help either buttress or undermine our ability to get along and our ability to progress. His book before this one was also a terrific book. It's called The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. And when that was released, Sam Harris and I both interviewed Jonathan on Sam Harris's podcast, Making Sense. You should go back and have a listen to that. That was one of two episodes that Sam very kindly invited me to co-host. And Jonathan, look, he worked for the Economist for a long time. He was at the sort of highest echelons of journalism. He now is a contributing editor at The Atlantic magazine. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And this conversation sort of morphed as I read this book. He sent me a galley copy from his publisher. And I thought, well, actually, there's so much more to talk about here than the sort of, I suppose, mundane or prosaic question about what happens over the next 4 years, because this is really about what happens over the next 40 years or 400 years to the future of human civilization, what kinds of institutions we need in order to be able to get along. And Jonathan's new book is really provocative because he identifies essentially the Evangelical Church as not necessarily an impediment to human flourishing, thoughtfulness, pluralism, democracy, and tolerance, but an indispensable part of the American democratic toolkit. So we get into it. I hope you enjoy this as much as I did. The one, the only, Jonathan Rauch. Okay, fabulous. All right, where is your head in week 2 of Trump 2?
My head is that what we're looking at is in some ways more in the nature of a regime change than an administration change, that it is a bad situation and getting worse.
In what respect?
Anything else?
Nope, I think that about
you were not expecting.
Thanks, John. Lovely to talk to you again. I'll see you next time.
Yeah, just a little pick me up there. I wish I could say, we'll get over it. Our institutions are strong. We'll get some vigorous shakeup of calcified policies, but unfortunately, that's not the story I'm seeing.
So before every U.S. election, in my memory, there were people saying this is the election that is going to change everything. In 2016, our friend Andrew Sullivan responded to Trump's first win by writing a piece entitled, I think, "The Republic Repeals Itself." And George W. Bush's win was, portrayed as catastrophic. Why is your response not just the same overblown huff?
Well, I hope it proves to be. That's for sure. But I'm about to use a multisyllabic word, and it's a new word to me. And it will take just a moment, if we have it, to explain why I'm using this word. That word is patrimonialism. How many syllables is that? Patrimonialism. I think that's seven if you count the S and M as one syllable. Mm-hmm. Do you know that phrase, by the way?
No.
Does that ring a bell? So I didn't either until recently. But it turns out in the literature of sociology, before we had the modern concept of totalitarianism, and even before we had what we today call authoritarianism, this term patrimonialism was invented by Max Weber, the great sociologist, like 100+ years ago, to indicate what he said is pretty much the most common type of government. Patrimonialism is when you run the government as a family business. So you got a big man on top, and then you've got loyalty tests. And the thing that matters most is loyalty to the governing person or family, personal loyalty, fealty. And Weber contrasts patrimonialism with basically modern bureaucratic rule. And that's where you have systems, rules, institutions, an impersonal form of rule, which he argues is much more recent. Really, it's invented by Bismarck and only recently becomes established well. And once it becomes established, it pretty much outcompetes patrimonialism because patrimonialism has problems like corruption and incompetence because you're promoting and continuing people based on personal ties and back scratching and patronage, not on the basis of merit. So if you want to run a big modern state with a big modern military and economy, you need a bureaucracy. And that's what we do so well. Okay, so along come a couple scholars. Their names are Hansen and Kopstein. I forget their first names. They just wrote a book a couple months ago called The Assault on the State. And I'm listening to them on a podcast, and they're explaining patrimonialism. And of course, the light bulb goes on. The reason they're explaining it is that this is the form of government that Trump is instituting in his second term. Now, this explains a lot, right? This explains the loyalty tests, which he's administering to everyone he hires, personal loyalty to him. The way they ask that is, do you believe the election was stolen? It explains why he is putting in the power agencies, the ones that can go out and arrest people or use military force and that sort of thing. Why he's putting loyalists in there, including someone like Pete Hegseth, who is incompetent by any reasonable bureaucratic convention. Why he's putting someone like that at the Pentagon. This person will be loyal to him. It explains why he is installing people who are mediocre or worse. Someone like Tulsi Gabbard. These are people who are non-entities without him. They rely on him for their reputation and their legacy. That's not true of someone like James Mattis, his first term defense secretary. That person can walk away and still be a 4-star general. It explains why he's breaking the law. As a matter of course, he just fired, was it a dozen inspectors general? Now, he could have fired those people in a way that followed the law. It would require giving notice to Congress that they're going to be discharged in 30 days, and then 30 days later, they're gone. That's not what he did. He fired them illegally. He defied that law because he can. So this is patrimonialism. Yep. So here's the thing to understand about patrimonialism, which is where the light bulb went off for me. It's not the same as authoritarianism. And often it can be, and in fact frequently is, layered on top of democratic politics. You get elected governments that do this because a lot of people don't mind and because they're in on the deal. Classical authoritarianism will bureaucratize itself in many cases. It will put in place propaganda agencies, secret police, all of the things that you need to run an authoritarian state. Patrimonialism, by contrast, you can do that within the existing bureaucracy simply by appointing people who are loyal to the big guy. So it's much less institutionalized. Over time, patrimonialism tends to merge into authoritarianism. That's what happened in Putin's Russia, which starts as a classic patrimonial state where, Putin's the big guy and everyone has to be loyal. Over time, as it becomes more corrupt, it institutionalizes itself with authoritarianism. That's probably not going to happen here because Trump is not interested in classical authoritarianism. And even if he were, I don't think he's capable of it. But what he is doing is instituting patrimonial rule in the United States by imposing it on the existing structures of government. And the result of that, I don't think it'll be long-term authoritarianism, but it will greatly weaken and diminish our institutional capacity. So I think that's what's happening right now. And it's not good. The last go we had with patrimonialism or anything like it was probably under Andrew Jackson.
What does diminish our institutional capacity mean?
It means that a whole lot of very capable people will be fired or leave, that a lot of them will be either not replaced at all or replaced by people who are incompetent or corrupt, whose qualification for the job is that they're loyal to Donald Trump and MAGA world. It will mean that the rule of law will be hollowed out. It already is being hollowed out. Classic patrimonial move. You pardon your friends. You punish your enemies. You take away their Secret Service protection so they could get assassinated by a foreign government. This is all, right out of the patrimonial playbook, right? It's how, for example, a crime syndicate runs. So by the time you're done, you've greatly weakened norms like the rule of law, and you've greatly weakened the institutional capacity, the people and the norms that make our bureaucracies run effectively.
You mentioned pardoning your friends. Does Biden share blame for pardoning his friends and family?
I didn't like it, but, it's nothing like what Trump is doing. Trump starts his term pardoning 1,500 people, many of whom are violent attackers. There would be cop killers, right? They attack police. It doesn't get more legal than that. But the new rule is, if you're my friend, you'll be fine. If you're not my friend, you won't be fine. Again, classic patrimonialism.
John, is the silver lining of patrimonialism versus authoritarianism that it will be undone when the US term limit kicks in and Trump is gone in 4 years, with the exception of the fact that it does some damage to the civil service in the meantime?
Well, that's a big exception. It's going to damage the rule of law because this is going to show the world that you can break the law if you're president and get away with it. He won't be impeached. I think the courts will issue orders telling him to stop doing what he's doing, and he will ignore those orders. No one's in a position now that he's a lame duck president. No one's in a position to make him stop doing things he really wants to do. And so it will weaken the remit of the courts. And that will... The question is, after he's gone, how hard is that to rebuild? I don't think we just go right back to where we were before he was president. I don't know how much damage he does along the way. I agree with you that if it's this versus classic authoritarianism, where, you start doing what Hitler did in Germany in 1933, obviously this is better. But it's way less good than status quo ante.
This raises a couple of things that you bring up in your book, one of which I'll park for later, which is the erosion of trust in institutions. And we can talk about what the impact of Trump 2 might be on that already existing trend and how much of his rise is to blame on the erosion of trust in American society. But the other is, there's a passage in your book in which you call bullshit on the claims of evangelicals and evangelical churches that they sort of grudgingly had to support Donald Trump the first time around because they didn't want to support Hillary Clinton. And there's a passage where you basically say they had a million other ways that they could have expressed their antipathy or opposition towards the disdain of the secular liberal left as it was instantiated in the Clinton campaign, other than throwing their lot in with someone who was so antithetical to their principles. And is there a similar parallel with what's going on in politics? Like, how is it the case that Pete Hegseth has just been confirmed by other politicians in the view of this? What's the word? What's Faber's word for it again? What's this 7-syllable word?
Patrimonialism. Yeah, it's not.
So patrimonial.
It's not a catchy term.
No, it's a terrible name. We need mobster regime or something. But in the patrimonial view of what's happening, how the hell has he managed to just be supported by all of these other people who aren't natural allies?
Well, he's their friend, right? They're his friend.
But they're not.
Trump made a promise in his 2016 campaign. He says, I can get you the quote if you like, but he says, if I'm elected, you will have power. And in 2024, he says exactly the same thing. He goes before the National Association of Christian Broadcasters and says, if I'm elected, you'll have power like you've never had before. And in a famous quote in one of these speeches, he's constantly promising power to evangelicals. And one of them, he says, all you have to do is vote for me this time, and you'll never even need to vote again. So it's a classic patrimonial bargain. It's like, some guy rolls around in a Rolls Royce and says, hey, you know what? If you support me, then you're going to get a really great deal from me. You're going to be you're going to be a made man. Mm. And that's an attractive deal, especially if you feel like you have cultural grievances and you've been, disrespected and on the outside. So they like that deal. So they took it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an attractive deal if you have no morality.
There's this little thing in the Bible. I know there's that. But
if you ignore
come on, Josh,
the message that Jesus was sent to earth to preach, then it's a great deal.
Something about eternal life and the next world and the least of these, I know, but set that aside, okay?
You say towards the end of your book something interesting, and I'm going to read it. If you offered to let me rerun my life as a heterosexual white Protestant who saw my values reflected all around me and never needed to think about being persecuted or stigmatized, I'd reject the deal. Why?
Because I feel like being an outsider in 3 respects. I'm a homosexual, and I'm an atheist, and I'm a Jew. You can be all 3 of those things. That I have had the privileged position of not taking as much for granted. I think people in minority communities are the first to perceive injustice. And I think that it has been the greatest privilege of my life to work for LGBT equality, as it's now called, specifically gay marriage. And I think if I had just been a member of a majority and taken my status in society for granted, that I don't think I'd have the opportunity to make those contributions. And I'm guessing maybe, I don't know, you feel the same way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I enjoy being an outsider. I wouldn't want to be a normie. But it's an interesting thing the reason I raise it in this context is that part of the message of your new book is that one way for American Christianity to get out of the right-wing rut that it's in is for it to become more comfortable with the mindset that you just articulated and to accept that there can be a virtue in being a minority. And like Christianity doesn't have to rule everything. It's actually at its best when it is channeling the spirit of this dissident dude, Jesus, rather than constantly feeling aggrieved and terrified that it's no longer the main game in town.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. Jesus is a figure who's marginal in his own time. He's orthogonal to all previous thinkers, and I would argue all subsequent thinkers. Christianity has its strongest moral witness when it is fighting persecution and trying to change Roman society. It becomes decadent and corrupt when it gets power and uses that power very poorly and eventually loses it. There's this wonderful phrase, I quote Mark Labberton, who's a former president of Fuller Seminary, that Christianity is an exilic religion. At least it's at its best when it's exilic. That
exilic,
is,
meaning as in exile.
Yeah, as in exile, as in an outsider in its own community, as in bearing witness to Jesus and focusing society on the higher things of life instead of just being part of the shuffle of everyday life, being a consumer good or, being a political party. And I think he's right. And I think a lot of Christians think he's right. And the Christians attempt to integrate themselves with the Republican Party, basically become the base of the Republican Party and especially the MAGA movement in order to obtain power, is a deal that is, a lot of Christians say, including Pete Wehner in today's New York Times, is corrupting Christianity. It's corrupting the witness to Jesus.
There is an interesting phenomenon here, though, which is that in addition to there perhaps being cynical reasons why religious leaders have thrown their lot in with Make America Great and Donald Trump, you make the point that a lot of pastors you've spoken to will say, this isn't us doing this strategically, actually. This is coming from the pews. And we are torn between, if you've devoted your life to being a man of the cloth, you probably care about scripture more than you do about politics. But that the same can't necessarily be said of the person who just goes to church once a week and might care more about what Tucker Carlson says than about what the Bible says. And they're feeling immense pressure to be partisan. What do you do about that, and where's that coming from?
Well, those are two different questions, where it's coming from and what you do about it. There's a survey that a group called Barna Consulting, Christian Consulting Group, did a couple of years ago. They asked pastors, have you seriously considered quitting the pastorate over the past year? And 42% said yes. And the third reason they gave, after the first two were like, loneliness and it's a hard job, the number 3 reason in a long list was too political, too much politics. They hate it. They're there to preach the gospel of Jesus. This is the first wave of evangelical partisanship was, Falwell and Robertson. I don't know if those names ring a bell with Australians, but these were politicized pastors who played a big role in the Reagan years. So the first wave was top down. This wave of politicization and secularization among evangelicals is, as you say, bottom up. It seems a lot of it is driven by conservative media and cable news, that people watch cable news and come back to the church and say our way of life is under threat. There's a war on Christianity. Our kids are going to come home from school with changed sexes or changed genders, and the school won't even tell us. And there's a war going on, and we've got to win it. And otherwise, our whole way of life and our religion is endangered. And pastors will say, well, the Bible says, be not afraid. And these parishioners will say, well, I'm afraid. I should be afraid. We can't just do nothing. So this is what one pastor I interviewed called the battlefield mindset. And they hate it. They really don't like it. It's not why they want to be there. It's not necessarily why most church members are there. But you get these very active church members who bombard them on Monday morning after the sermon with all the reasons why the thing was too squishy. This Jesus stuff, turn the other cheek. Really? Come on. What's that about? We got to fight. So some of it's coming from the outside culture, and some of it is coming out of this, what we just talked about, this desire for power, this desire for influence, this feeling like, Christians should have power. It's exactly what Trump tells them.
Are we sure that they're wrong to want to fight? I mean, set aside the scriptural or spiritual reasons. Like, let's just address the concern, starting with the example that you just gave. They're worried that their kids going to school are going to be in a climate that is much more permissive of gender playfulness, shall we say, to be generous to the trans side, than they're comfortable with, and that the thumb of a trans ideology is on the scale of school boards and academic institutions and bureaucrats. Is that unfounded?
They're certainly not wrong to believe they have a stake in politics and want to influence that, of course. No one's questioning that. It's a question of how you engage in the civic realm. So again, I'm maybe at risk of filibustering here, but there's a big concept in my book, not original to me. And that concept is civic theology. So evangelicals have a phrase I didn't even know till I wrote this book, but it's very important in their world. And it's called discipleship, also known as spiritual formation. And that's the process of making yourself in the image of Jesus Christ, being like him in both word and deed. And the church has been pretty good about, they use it as a verb, discipling its members in their own church, their own community. You know, when the flood hits Asheville after Hurricane Helene, the churches are there. But there has been no work done in the evangelical world, or for that matter, the white Protestant world, on how you approach larger civil society in a Christ-like way. So that's a question of, how do you behave on social media, for example? Do you call people names? And how do you behave in the political realm? Do you engage in politics in a spirit of apocalyptic fear, such that if we don't win the next election, it's the end of everything? Do you leave yourself open for civil conversation and for compromise, working with others to figure things out if you can? Or are you more interested in voting for the most extreme candidate who will say the most extreme things? Do you want to drink the tears of the other side and crush them and remove them from the country in some way? Or do you understand your role as influencing politics but sharing the country? So these are very different approaches to politics, and there's been no discipleship in the public realm. Some Christians now are working on that. And the big surprise in my book is that the church that's doing the most work on that is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka Mormons. They're working very hard at this.
Let's park that for a moment, because I want to get there's a lot already though. So one thing that struck me was that the stridency that you're talking about in this uncompromising sort of attitude that's coming from religious institutions in the States has a parallel, like to channel the post-liberals, who are really the target of this book more than anyone, and we can go into who they are and what they believe. But people who basically religious philosophical thinkers in America who basically make the, well, why don't we start there? Why don't you articulate what a post-liberal mindset that you're attacking in the book is, and then I'll finish my question.
Well, you could probably define them as well or better than I. Do you have them in Australia?
No, but I have, for example, I interviewed Patrick Deneen when I was hosting a popular national radio show here called Late Night Live, briefly back when his book came out in 2018.
The first book,
Why Liberalism Failed or something. But okay, let me give it a crack then. The thesis would be something like small L liberalism, meaning sort of this pluralistic ideal of, freedom of speech and freedom of thought and, a kind of centrist, Blairite, Clintonite third way in politics is really just a veil for social justice types and lefties to impose their wishes on the rest of us. It's deadening to the soul and corrosive to community, and eventually turns into a libertine miasma where nobody has any meaning and everybody is dressing in whatever clothes they want, and gender is up in the air, and roles are up, household roles are up in the air, and there is no mooring or no anchoring anymore for society. And what's needed is a reinstitution of a more communitarian and religious sensibility, not just culturally, but also politically, and a recognition that the great liberal experiment has failed, and we need a more traditional way of life. And these people are often fans of Viktor Orban in Hungary, and would like a more illiberal, they're reactionaries essentially against what they see as a smaller liberal status quo. Is that? close.
Yeah, that's very well done. They say that liberalism, now we're talking about small L liberalism, not modern progressivism. That's probably clear to Australian audiences, but Americans get very confused about that. But they say that small L liberalism, the John Locke and Immanuel Kant and the founders and all of that, pretends to be a kind of neutral process in which all can thrive. And it's not. In fact, it is an imperialistic cultural ideology that sacrifices faith, family, tradition, and the other foundations of a moral society on the altar of consumerism, individualism, radical freedom, personal autonomy, unconstrained, and that it does this in a way that essentially mows down all opposition, including, all of those good anchors of society. And that liberalism has undermined itself, because once you undermine those values of faith, family, tradition, nation, community, there's nothing left to support liberalism except an overweening woke state. And that, they think, is where we are. And so that's their view, and it's been influential in some circles. And there's a lot to say about it.
So let me just finish the question then that I was about to ask, which I didn't want to get to until we had articulated for people what we're talking about when we talk about post-liberals, which is that the post-liberal response to your criticism earlier of the stridency of religious institutions and the partisanship of the pews is to say, well, of course, they've been cornered into this by an increasingly strident secular left, which takes no prisoners and insists on pushing its LGBTQIA plus and equality of the sexes and Me Too movement style reforms and cancel culture into every nook and cranny of American public life. And so what you're seeing is an understandable reaction to a hegemonic secular cultural movement. What do you say to that?
I say that the left is illiberal too. And the answer is liberalism got it right. Liberalism is not value-free. There's a marvelous new book about this by a guy named Alexander Lefebvre. You might want to look into him for your show, but it's called Liberalism as a Way of Life. But he points out something that's true, which is it's not the case that liberalism is just, a hollow, neutral, procedural platform. And the post-liberals are right about that. And that liberalism rests on certain values of its own. And guess what? They're great values. They're things like toleration, civility, lawfulness, truthfulness. These are the things that the founders called Republican virtues and, in fact, counted on civil society, including especially Christianity, to inculcate. So the far left and the far right have in common that they believe liberalism has failed and they want to impose their own agenda using authoritarian and coercive means, and they are each other's best friends. This is the flaw with the idea that, the way you disempower the woke left is by empowering the authoritarian right. They love each other. They're good for each other's business. If you want to disempower the far left, you strengthen the center. You strengthen that substantial majority of Americans who, just want a common sense playbook. And the center is center right, center left, but that's what you do. So I think their premise is wrong. And their solution is wrong. Other than that, they're fine.
How big of you. The second thing that I flagged at the beginning, which I want to close the loop on before we continue, is trust in institutions, the decline of trust. This is a background theme in your book, although you don't go at it as overtly as you have in your past works. But I think without the decline in trust in institutions, you don't get Donald Trump. You probably don't get the church as quite as partisan a political actor as it has become, being the institution of last resort for religious people in a world where they feel betrayed by the institutions of state. Can you diagnose that for us? I'll keep the question about diagnosis and solution separate this time.
Well, there's a whole academic literature. It's, mountainous in size, that's trying to understand the collapse of trust in institutions. And it's pretty much everything except the military in the United States. And the later the generation, that is, the younger the cohort, the greater this decline is. I talk to young people who say that there's no institution they trust. And you say, really? Not even one? And that kind of cynicism bordering on nihilism, that's making us ungovernable. So why it happened, it's over-explained. It's what's the word, over-determined? Yeah. So many things have happened. I'll tell you something I emphasize, Josh, that other people don't. The big thing people tend to say is that the institutions became corrupt or incompetent or self-interested, and thus they lost our trust. And I don't really think that's true. Speaking now for the United States, but I think I could probably also say Australia, for example, as well. I don't think there is an earlier era for whose institutions I would take in place of our own. I think those institutions had equal or larger problems. Just for example, they were viciously racist in America, viciously,
and Australia certainly,
anti-Semitic, very often corrupt in ways which were not the case today. It is true our institutions made big mistakes, Vietnam War and so on, but it is also true that our institutions have done reasonably good jobs of trying to correct those mistakes and rebuild and move on. I point out to people that the two things that a government really needs to do, the central government, that no other force in society can do, is defend the country from a foreign adversary and back up the economy when it's in a full-scale collapse. And in the United States, when attacked by Al-Qaeda, the United States effectively wiped out Al-Qaeda. And when the economy collapsed, the government backstopped it, did a very good job. I think Congress came through for COVID in the United States with a lot of aid, probably saved the economy again. So here's where I just get off the boat with everyone else, maybe including you, but I just go for it, which is, I don't think it's so much that institutions failed the public as that the public failed our institutions. Starting in the 60s on the left with, burn, baby, burn, and don't trust anyone over 30 and all of that. It became fashionable on the left to attack institutions. And then starting in the era of Rush Limbaugh, you get the populist right, which is even more vituperative against institutions. They're all corrupt. They're all left dominated. They're out to get you. I think a lot of this was done for profit and for power. But I think when you have a 50-year war on institutions conducted by politicians and partisans and activists who have a stake in demolishing institutions for gain, eventually that will have a bad effect. So it's not everyone else's explanation, but
no, I like it.
I think it's a big chunk of it.
Yeah, you mentioned there maybe we're on different trains there, and I would say that 18 months ago or 2 years ago, we would have been on different trains because I was more critical of institutions. But now I regard the mind virus of whinging about institutions as part of the the big problem itself, actually. I think I was wrong in the latter part of COVID to hold institutions to, I certainly didn't hold them to such an unreasonably high standard as some of my peers, but I think I've come around to agreeing with you that the phenomenon of there's a passage in your book. One of the aha moments in your new book for me was to make the claim that institutions ought to be treated with the same grace as religion expects us to treat individual human beings. That institutions are human-made creations, and just as we shouldn't denigrate people wholly and entirely, no matter how bad their mistakes, we shouldn't do the same to our own institutions. We should have a certain amount of forgiveness and bigness of heart when it comes to our institutions, just as we understand that we should to our fellow man. And that hit me hard, because how high is the bar that we set for human institutions that we would never expect of any other human endeavor? Like, how right does the CDC have to get it? You know, how flawless does I mean, you mentioned COVID. I mean, quite apart from the economic support that governments provided during COVID, which probably was too much because it then caused an inflation crisis, but the epidemiological work, you know, even Trump on Project Warp Speed, you know, his signature achievement, throwing a huge amount of money as a guarantee to drug companies that the US government would buy up whatever drugs they had, regardless of whether they worked.
And cutting a lot of red tape.
Yeah, those are institutions working. The post-liberal, sorry.
That is so right. You know, it's so easy to denigrate these institutions. Another podcaster, Andrew Keene, you may know him, asked me to say what were the 5 most interesting or important events of the last of 2024. And I put on that list something that's almost completely forgotten, which is, maybe it's unknown in Australia. You're about to tell me. But in April of last year, a giant, what do they call it? A container ship hit the Bay Bridge in Baltimore, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, and took down the bridge. A catastrophe. Did any of this surface in the Australian press?
Not that I know.
So this is a traffic bridge. It's a very important bridge, and it spans the harbor. This happened at, I think it was about 1:25 a.m. So the ship, once it realized that it couldn't apply the brakes or change direction, then it was heading straight for the pier supporting the bridge, radioed a distress call to the land-based authorities. And within 1 minute, literally 1 minute, police on that bridge closed it to traffic. The result of that is that only 6 lives were lost on that bridge. And those were construction workers who were there doing work. Mercifully, this was, of course, 1:30 in the morning. That helps. But it's pretty hard to complain about a 1 minute response time to get that bridge closed. What then happens is this could take a very long time to repair, but instead, within, I think it's, don't hold me to this, but I think it's within 6 weeks, the authorities in Baltimore have opened a channel through the bridge. Now, this whole bridge has collapsed, right? It's there. They found a channel through it, and within 3 months, they had the harbor fully functional, under budget and ahead of schedule. And I put that on my list, Josh, because no one knows it. We just take it for granted when these institutions respond well, or even phenomenally well. So what turned you around on this question? I'm curious. What changed your mind in the past 18 months?
It was gradual, so it's hard to pinpoint. I can't identify in my head a specific moment, but it's been a growing, I think it's come along in parallel with my finding increasingly tired the anti-woke shtick. The two have been a self-reinforcing evolution. The anti-woke, anti-cancel culture, there are so many things you can't say anymore because the left has gone crazy. Shtick has become obviously fatuous and, whilst still true in many ways, has become so cynically deployed by people who have much worse motives that I think I'm placing greater scrutiny. Like, my bullshit detector is just more sensitively refined than it would have been in 2022 to claims of incompetent or secret cabals doing things terribly and betraying the common man. There's just something conspiratorial and potentially authoritarian about the mindset that wants to go around hunting for ways in which dark, powerful forces are corrupting everything. that I've become more suspicious of.
Well, that's interesting. Wokeness is on the decline around here, and that's pretty evident. And yet a lot of folks in America on the right are still claiming it's as bad as ever, and the institutions are all against us. You know, you'd never know that Donald Trump just won a famous victory and banned DEI throughout the entire government. From the way some of them talk, I resonate with what you're saying, which is that a lot of these guys who are denigrating institutions and complaining that they're being battered by the culture every day are actually in business for themselves and doing mighty well.
Yeah. Also, does the critique help? Like, to the extent that the critique helps us reform institutions and make them more effective, great. But if the critique further erodes the trust that is required in order to make institutions perform, then stop helping, buddy.
Yes.
Like, go and reform the institutions if you're worried about the institutions. And so,
that's exactly right. It kind of circles back, I think, to the question or point you made earlier, which is, isn't it true that there are problems with politics that Christians do want to engage with and change because they disagree? And the answer is, yeah. Okay. So how do you get that done? Do you do it by shrieking that it's the end of the world and you're going to drown liberals in their own tears? Or do you find a way to improve the situation? Do you show up, for example, at the school board meeting screaming that your children are being propagandized by woke socialists? Or do you go into that district and work with teachers and principals and others to try to figure out how to arrange things in a better way? And what folks like Curtis Chang, who you were citing earlier, who's got this idea, this theology about institutional love, loving our institutions, which are human, they're human institutions. And what the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is doing, which is saying we should, without giving up on any of our principles, we should play a peacemaking role, a role of patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation. What they're doing is saying you can approach these institutions in a more Christ-like way. And in fact, as you do that, you can get better results as a result of approaching institutions in a Christ-like way.
One of the points that is foundational to the argument that you're making in the book is that there are common principles between the Madisonian small L liberal respect for institutions and Christianity, which is something I hadn't really thought about. I mean, I've thought about, it's interesting because this book is almost a rebuke to yourself of a quarter century ago, but yourself of a quarter century ago is where I still am with respect to religion, which is, I think there's something deeply silly about it and deeply hypocritical and corrupting about institutionalized dogma. And I think we would just be better off if we could be more enlightened and more secular and more Danish about everything instead of as religiously deranged as the United States. And yet the point that you're making is that that's actually a phony binary, that it is not that Christianity is set up on one side and secular liberalism on another. There is a shared root system, and we just have to foster that root system. Can you articulate what that is?
Well, that was so articulate that I'm not sure I could quite match it. I love shared root system as a metaphor, and I may pick that up. You know, you have a future in journalism.
Tell that to the public broadcaster in Australia.
You'll leave them in the dust. So, yeah, I was 23 years ago. I wrote what I now call the dumbest thing I ever wrote. And it celebrated secularization and said religion is a source of dogma and division and we'll be better off without it. So isn't it a wonderful thing that in America, the role of religion is fading, specifically Christianity. And, you know, I'm a homosexual American born in 1960. So I grew up seeing on an industrial bigotry and hate and hypocrisy and cruelty toward homosexual people And of course, a good deal of that certain quarters of conservative white Protestantism in America. So I'm not whitewashing any of that, but the experiment that would be great in 2003 has taken place. We've seen in the United States what's called the Great Dechurching. It's a collapse of Christianity, and especially white evangelical Christianity. That looked like the strong wing of Christianity, the sort of the ecumenical mainline Christian churches collapsed in the last century, but this century it's now the evangelical churches that are dechurching, and it's happening at a stunning rate. And it turns out that instead of making the country more governable, this has made the country less governable. People are more isolated. They are more lonely. Worse than that, they are turning to substitute religions, which some of them are, they're like Wicca. They just don't do the job of inculcating age-old values. But some of them are just actively destructive, like QAnon. And I'd argue that MAGA is one and that wokeness is one. These substitute religions. Partisan politics has become a kind of religion in the United States. It's a source of identity. And if you're losing the next election, that's an apocalyptic event. So it turns out that the founders were right, and that religion is a load-bearing wall in our democracy, and that there are just some things we rely on it to do, like socialize people into what the founders called Republican virtue, and that the substitutes for religion are much worse. And that means that people like me, although I don't think I'll ever be a believer, I don't think I have it in me, I have developed an attitude that we need to cherish our religious institutions, and that they are essential.
It feels a bit like throwing in the towel. Like the challenge was to make people less religious and to shepherd them, for want of a better verb, towards secularism and Enlightenment values. And because many of them have left formal religion and gone into woo-woo, be it wokeism or Trumpism, we therefore have to give up and herd them back into churches where they can be sold a bunch of nonsense about the nature of the cosmos and the nature of the history of what happened in the Middle East 2,000 years ago, instead of finding ways to create secular institutions that will be robust and thrive in the 22nd century and create a new civilization.
Well, it'll have to be both, because I'm not for herding anyone into any place or asking anyone to be religious who doesn't believe in religion. The only reason to join a religion is because you think it's true. There's no other good reason to do that. And I don't want anyone to be, to pretend to believe something they don't, and couldn't make them do that if I tried. So my message is actually quite different from that. It's that in the annals of human sociology, it appears that nothing is remotely as good as organized religion, and especially the great organized religions, at organizing people into worship and communal participation, at inculcating core values and a certain kind of community spiritedness, and focusing them on the larger things in life than just their personal grievances and whims. And those religions have been around for a long time for a reason. They're pretty good at that. Now, they also, as you and I know all too well, they have a dark side. We don't deny that. So that being the case, it appears to be just a fact that a lot of people rely on religion to give themselves a sense of purpose in life. And it also appears to be an empirical fact that no, the secular substitutes are not as good. Having said all that, as I say, I'm not for herding anyone into believing anything false. I'm saying something actually quite different, which is the gospel of Jesus Christ is very supportive of the constitutional values of James Madison. They're really very close. And white evangelical Protestantism in America has turned its back on many of those Christian virtues that Christ preached and that Madison depended on. And I'm not saying that Christians, I'm I'm not saying that anyone should become a Christian who doesn't want to be. And I'm also not saying that Christians should abandon Christianity to become more secular or more democratic, small d, large d, or more Republican or more liberal. I'm just saying, why don't Christians give a little bit more Christianity a try? Because what they're doing now isn't working. It's wrecking our country, and it is harming their witness. It is shrinking their faith. So maybe the gospel of Jesus Christ and his very different approach to how you engage the world and what you think is important, maybe that would be a better message for our country and for Christianity. This seems like, not the world's most controversial thing to say. Does that address your
yes, it does.
Your dissatisfaction?
And, there's another
point about throwing in the towel.
I mean, look, I still have lingering questions about. You mentioned briefly in the book Scandinavia and Japan and places like that, and say, well, they're not as culturally diverse as the United States, so maybe they're different. But I still have a big question mark about that, about why is the US supposedly this place that can't figure out what many other countries have, which is how to marry community with secularism.
Well, the first thing I'd say to that is, have you looked at those other countries lately? Have you looked at Hungary, Italy, Germany, several Scandinavian countries, though it's hard to tell them apart, France? Have you looked at how they're becoming ungovernable? Have you looked at the rise of the authoritarian populist right in many of those countries? The next president of France may be Marine Le Pen. Poland barely managed to pull itself out of the PiS government that it had, but they're waiting in the wings.
Those are not the countries that are generally held up as being secular bastions. Those are some of the more religious countries in Europe, Poland.
We're seeing the same forces in Scandinavia. We're seeing the rise of a populist right wing there. It's all over the world, and there's lots of reasons for it. You can cite social media and media fragmentation, and you can cite the global migration crisis. So those things are in play, but it's also very plausible to say that they're having some of the same problems we are, which is that when Christianity is not doing its job of aligning public values with public governability, I guess you could say, it leaves the door open for other more sinister forces to enter and say, well, you want meaning in life? I'll give you meaning in life. It's those damned immigrants. We're losing our lifeblood as a country.
Possibly. But I mean, these are places, Japan and, Denmark and Norway are places that have been non-religious for a half century. And now we see this phenomenon of a growing far right. And one can say, one can attribute the decline of religion to that, but one could also just not, and could just say something else is going on that's causing the far right to emerge in places that are both religious, like the United States, and non-religious, like Norway. I don't think it gets you very far to say, you're coming very close to bumping up against the criticism that you make of the post-liberals, which is what's your alternative exactly? The post-liberals are we don't have community anymore, and we're all atomized, smaller liberal individuals, to which you say, and your alternative is point me to the utopia of pleasure and plenty where everybody is living happily in a theocracy.
In a way, Josh, the point I'm making is so obvious, and it's such a short hop, from premise to conclusion, that I would argue it's very different from what the post-liberals are doing, which is a very long hop. And my proposition is only that our societies will be more governable if what Christianity preaches is more closely aligned with, first, what the gospel says, and through that, the Republican virtues that the founders called on. That when Christianity and liberal democracy are pulling in opposite directions, you're going to have some very serious problems, and we're facing those. and that when they're more closely aligned and supportive of each other, things will work better. To me, that seems like a fairly obvious proposition.
Right.
But maybe I'm missing something.
No, it is a fairly obvious proposition. It is just, as you say, a smaller bore proposition than the proposition that religion is antithetical to reason, and that therefore we should undertake every opportunity that we can to diminish its influence. Because I do understand what you're saying, which is it's not you're not just calling on religion to reform itself. You're also calling on secular Americans and secular people everywhere to reform their understanding of religion as well, and to have some more empathy for the institutions of religion, and to display some greater grace and civility. I mean, you make an interesting point about civility, which I liked as well, because I find myself tied up in knots about this notion of civility. I don't like the expectation that every conversation ought to be civil, because the name of this podcast is Uncomfortable Conversations, right? And I think there is a virtue in calling out bullshit. And yet you want the bullshit calling out to be constructive, and you want it to be done in a way where if someone did it to me, I would ultimately be grateful for it having been done. And I think you make that point. I don't have it in front of me, about civility, that civility is not the same as being nice, but about what is civility to you?
To me, it's about a core liberal value of approaching everyone on the assumption that their dignity and value as a human being is the equal of mine, and treating them the way I would want to be treated in that situation. And of course, if that means that they're wrong, I would want to be corrected, so I will correct them, but I will do it in a way that will respect their humanity and would be the way I would hope to be treated by them. Civility is, you're right, it's not just politeness, and it's something that the founders counted on, and basically it's willingness to share the country.
I think it was Richard Dawkins who said to a religious person who said that they were offended by his challenging their claims, that I respect you too much to pretend to respect your stupid beliefs.
Yeah, and that's
not a tactful way of putting it. But
it's not tactful, but it's not uncivil either. David Blankenhorn, who you may know, he's one of the founders of Braver Angels, among other distinctions. We used to be antagonists on opposite sides of the same-sex marriage debate, and became friends as a result of that in the end. And he wound up coming over to our side on that view and became an advocate for same-sex marriage. But that's neither here nor there. But he says this very thoughtful thing, which is that civility rests upon doubt. Civility means approaching someone with the idea that I might be wrong, and that gives me a certain inclination and maybe even obligation to listen, to come to someone with a sense of curiosity. And I think there's something to that, something about doubt.
I mean, it doesn't sound very religious, I got to say. It's expecting a lot of a religious. If you truly believe that the creator of the universe wrote a book, why should you doubt your faith? It's right there in the book.
Well, I won't try to answer that question because I don't believe the book either. But when I do read the book, I look at what Jesus Christ actually says. So maybe can we just talk for a minute about the substance of the alignment between the gospel of Jesus and the Constitution of Madison?
Please. To
me, that's really the core idea of the book. And maybe it'll help clarify if I spell that out. Is that okay for just a moment?
Absolutely. Yeah, let's describe the roots.
So when I ask Christians, what are the essential tenets of Christianity, if you had to recite them, as it were, standing on one leg, they say, number one, don't be afraid, possibly the most frequently repeated injunction in the Bible. Second, imitate Jesus, strive to be like him. And third, forgive each other. Retribution and vengeance belongs to the Lord, not to us. So, I mean, others say, well, there's repentance, that's big, and others, but those three are pretty uncontroversial. as the core elements of Christian teaching.
Just say that again. Be not afraid.
Be not afraid. Imitate Jesus and forgive each other.
Forgive. Right.
So my breakthrough in understanding all this, in writing this book, was to look at those three values and say, those look a lot like the core premises of what we call Madisonian pluralism. But this is, to put it in a less fancy way, this is the constitutional values that our founders gave us and depended on us and told us we would have to maintain. They didn't just give us the Constitution. They said we've got to defend the values that underlie the Constitution. So be not afraid maps pretty neatly onto rotation in office. Sometimes you're going to lose an election. It's not the end of the world. You've got to have some confidence in the system and in your fellow countrymen so that you lose the election, but maybe you can learn something that becomes stronger and it won't destroy the nation. So the whole idea of the Flight 93 election, this election is the end of the world.
Just explain
that is not a Republican attitude.
Election.
Yeah. I'm sorry?
Just explain that reference.
Oh, yeah. This is a metaphor in 2016. Flight 93 was the flight that was taken over by terrorists and was aimed for the Capitol and was grounded when the passengers took it down. So the idea is that the bad guys, the woke people on the left, have taken over the cockpit, and this election is the very last chance to stop them. So that's number one. Be not afraid. You can't, Madisonian pluralism, it relies on trust. Number two, be like Jesus. So Jesus is an extraordinary figure because he is a radical egalitarian. And he judges how well a regime is doing by how it treats the least of these. And he believes in the fundamental inherent dignity of every human being. That translates directly into the Republican virtues of everyone enjoys basic rights, fundamental rights, inalienable rights, as it was put in a famous document. And we all enjoy a certain basic equality. And that's how we're supposed to treat each other, not in law, but you asked about civility, that those presumptions of basic dignity as humans and basic equality in the system, that's liberalism in a nutshell. And then number three, forgive each other. So that doesn't map, I think, quite as clearly, but it's pretty closely related to the liberal democratic idea of forbearance, which means, okay, sometimes you're going to win an election. Do you then try to purge the country of the other side? Do you say you're going to crush the libs and drink their cheers? And the answer is no. You need to treat them the way you want them to treat you one of these days when they're in power and you're not. So you need to show forbearance. It's not quite the same as forgiveness, but it's related. So I'm looking at this and saying, I'm not asking anything of Christians except to more closely, more accurately reflect what Jesus is telling them to do. And I'm just saying, if they do that, I'm not a believer, but if you guys do that, what Jesus tells you to do, it will be good for this country and probably good for your faith.
So the church that has gotten that memo, which you spend the last third of the book looking at, is the Mormon Church. You mentioned it earlier. Do you want to just explain that to us, what they're doing?
Yeah, this is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as they're now called. And this was a big surprise for me. It's wound up being one of the reasons I wrote the book. Let's see, how much detail, Josh?
Well, just go back to 2008 and
yeah, that's where I was headed.
Yeah.
So in 2008, the Supreme Court of California ordered gay marriage, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints came out fiercely against that. They had all of their bishops, that's what they call their pastors, read a statement across the pulpit, mobilizing Mormons to stop this thing. And they succeeded in stopping it. And there was a mighty backlash against the church, which they were not prepared for. People in our community, the gay and lesbian community, were so hurt and wounded and offended by that. And that led to a rethink, which led them to compromise in 2015 with the LGBT group in Utah, a landmark compromise that they supported and helped negotiate that passed a LGBT non-discrimination bill in Utah, deep red, deep conservative Republican Utah, and also included some specific religious liberty carve-outs for religious organizations so that, Brigham Young University, which is their university, would not have to house married same-sex couples in the married dorms, things like that, things that the LGBT group in the state, Equality Utah, said, yeah, sure, we can live with that. And the result of this was not only to provide those protections, but the compromise itself, the process of negotiating this open channels between the Mormons and the conservatives in the legislature and Equality Utah, which have lasted to this day, those bonds of trust. You asked earlier, how do you rebuild institutions? Well, part of it is people go to do the actual work of sitting down together, figuring it out. And that is still the case today. So I'm looking at this, I'm gobsmacked. I wonder what's going on. And then in 2021, the number 2 person in their church, very hierarchical, who is a former Utah State Supreme Court justice, very distinguished constitutional scholar in his own right, gives a speech saying that our duty as Christians is to model patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation. And they, in fact, do that. They wound up helping put through a bill that enshrined my marriage, same-sex marriage, your marriage if you're an American, in federal statute, even though their church opposes homosexuality as a sin and opposes same-sex marriage. You can get excommunicated for it, yet they helped pass a law that enshrined it in law and added some religious liberty protections, which put them at ease. So what's going on here is that they have developed a theology that what Christ wants us to do on this planet as Mormons, as members of the church, is be peacemakers. For them, that is being like him. And that doesn't mean you give up on your core values, but it does mean you engage in patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation. You don't stoke the fires of the culture war. You look for ways to bring people together. And that's what they're actually doing.
Is part of one of my worries about using them as an analogy is that, as I understand it, that church regards the U.S. Constitution as one of its holy documents, doesn't it? Don't they think the Constitution was written by God?
They believe the Constitution is divinely inspired, though not written by God. They do have 4 scriptures. The Constitution. Well, the Constitution's not one of their holy scriptures. They have 4 of those: the Jewish Bible, the Christian Bible, and then 2 of their own. But yeah, they do believe the Constitution's divinely inspired. Yeah, but Josh, it's
a shorter leap for a Mormon to regard the founding document of the United States as sacred than it is for another Christian, right? I mean, the other Christian can say, our job here is to preside over a Christendom that flourishes, and that is a more senior pursuit than defending.
Well, don't get the wrong idea. The church is not espousing these values because they think the Constitution is sacred. They're espousing these values because they think that's Christ's commandment. Okay. They think that the Constitution embodies those ideas and values, but the values themselves are coming from Jesus Christ and his teaching and church teachings that go to some very fundamental ideas they have about free will and agency and things like that.
Right. And in the example that you gave, you talk about conversations that you've had with people who advocate, Mormons who were pushing for this accommodation with the gay community, and them saying that it's not just a strategic, it's 2 things, right? It's a strategic policy, a position, because they think that getting half a loaf is better than no loaf, in the sense that if they help write the gay marriage legislation, then they can also ensure that it contains provisions for religious freedom that will enshrine their ability to continue discriminating against gay people. And then on the other hand, in addition to being strategic, it's what you just alluded to, which is it's also a spiritual desire to be bigger than any particular policy.
Yeah. So a different way of putting that, I don't think they're doing this as a strategic call because some lobbyist in Washington told them this is a way to get a better deal. And I think we know that because I mentioned that in 2022, they helped push through an effort that enshrines same-sex marriage in statute, which is really important, by the way, because there's a movement to overturn the Supreme Court decision that made gay marriage legal in America.
I know. You Americans are always leaving everything up to the courts. Just write a goddamn law, for crying out loud.
Well, that's what we did. It's a huge deal, Josh. It's just a huge deal for me and Michael's marriage to be now established in federal law and statute. Right. So the answer is that they could have just sat it out. They could have done nothing, or they could have done what others in Christian world did, which is basically throw spitballs. And the result of that would have been either the law that passed without them having to endorse it or nothing at all, in which case they could say they had no part of gay marriage. The fact that they got involved to actually push this through, I think is more than just strategic. I think it's a way of, I think it is based on their genuine theological commitment to what they see as their role in American society right now.
Right. I mean, my only point would be that if you can't persuade other churches on the basis of spirituality, you might be able to persuade them on the basis of strategy.
Well, I know I'll try that. The cultural oppositionalism and the church of fear, and the apocalyptic rhetoric, that gets them nothing.
Yeah.
Whereas, so here's the other side of the
bums in seats. It might get them bums in the pews.
No, they're abandoning the pews. This is the whole problem. I have a card here just full of statistics, and it's like, I mean, some of this stuff is amazing. 40 million people just between 2008 and 2022 have completely left religion and are no longer attending services. Church membership, which was 70% right through the 20th century, is now below half just in the last 20 years. You can go on and on. So no, it is not keeping bums in seats. It turns out that doing partisan politics is not something people want in church. So that's not working for them. And then if you look at what the Respect for Marriage Act did, this is the law that made my marriage part of federal law. So the other half of that law said that never will the United States government use tax breaks and federal dollars and federal contracts or anything else of that sort to try to nudge or force churches to recognize same-sex marriages if they don't want to. This takes off the table the biggest single fear the church had, which is, if we don't recognize gay marriage in our churches, we'll lose our tax breaks. And the progressive left, had threatened to do that. Under the Respect for Marriage Act, 100% of the Democrats in Congress went on record as saying, we are not going to use federal government power to force you guys to recognize same-sex marriage. That is in my view, I think it's a good thing, period, because I'm for religious freedom. But that is a very big win. That is way better than you actually do if you just hunker down in the corner and you don't engage.
There will be gay act. I mean, again, like any good compromise, you'll cop it from both sides on this one, right? I mean, religious people will say, why should we be forced to get on board with a cultural shift that we're deeply opposed to? And gay activists will say, well, would you be okay with carving out an exemption for churches to be racist? Why is it our community that has to cop it? Like, if it's a civil rights issue, I mean, I think you actually answered this beautifully in the book. Let me quote you, John. Something every writer enjoys.
The book is better than the movie.
This is as good a defense of pluralism as I've read. When my LGBT friends, you write, demand that their weddings be served by every business, no matter the enterprise's size, location, or faith, they may see enforcement of customers' civil rights. But I see doctrinaire totalism. If a balance can be struck, allowing the large majority of LGBT couples to obtain wedding services while exempting a modest number of mostly small businesses, that's not a win for one side and a loss for the other. It's a win for both because it de-escalates the tensions which tear the fabric of pluralism. So there you go. I've just answered my question for you.
Yeah, that's
need you here
beautifully said, Josh.
I could conduct this entire interview just by asking a question and then reading from a book, like a pastor.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
It goes back to something you said earlier, but I just want to hear a bit more about it. So you are where I was 22 years ago, which is very skeptical of Christianity and religion, thinking we'd be probably better off without it if we could. And I want to know to what extent either this book or events generally have changed that attitude.
I'll need to sleep on this book for 6 months to know the answer to that question, probably. I think it's shifted something because I respect your wisdom, I suppose, not to make you feel old, but, I wouldn't be surprised if my own trajectory mirrored yours. The rootlessness and madness of the world at the moment makes me understand why some people will reach for religion as the missing jigsaw piece that would resolve everything. I mean, not formally religious people, but just there's a whole wing of the kind of new right that bemoans the loss of religion and leaps on the fact that Richard Dawkins called himself a cultural Christian, or that Ayaan Hirsi Ali has become a Christian, or that there's a reassuring sense of stability that comes not just from religion, but even now some people on the right calling for monarchism or other forms of traditional institutional methods of rooting ourselves to some sort of certainty in a disorienting world. But I just regard it as it still smells to me like a cop-out, like throwing in the towel, like we're a civilization that is currently going through an information revolution that is turning everything upside down, that is about to be exacerbated by an artificial intelligence revolution. And this is as profound as the discovery of fire or the printing press. And we are currently a bunch of baby giraffes trying to learn how to stand up, all covered in placental goo. And we don't know how to do so. And so we're grasping for things that feel familiar. And the church is one of those things. It strikes me that that's probably closer to the truth. But that if we look back with the long lens of the future, a future historian will look back and go, well, obviously, thinking that Christianity was the solution to their problem of how to converse with one another and find meaning in community was short-lived.
Are you saying it's too bad that we have to rely on this crutch, but we do need to rely on it? Or are you saying we don't need the crutch at all and we'll make this transition more effectively if we don't resort to religion? I'm
saying I suspect that humankind will only survive in the long term if we figure out a way to do it without religion.
Well, you may be right.
Now is the moment, but at some point it will be.
The most frequently asked question I get about this book and all this work that I've been doing is, can Christianity repair itself? Can it become relevant again? There's a lot of sociological evidence that maybe it can't, that maybe society is just secularizing. And if that's the case, then we have to see if we can find new substitutes for religion that are not as toxic as the ones that we're using now. Soul Cycle is fairly benign, but it doesn't do the job of providing a transcendent anchor for our values.
Speak for yourself, John.
So then it's an open question whether I think people have an innate need. Most people, not everyone, but a lot of people have an innate need for some sense that they're here for a reason that's larger than themselves, that they're not just, a clump of random cells which came together for a while and then disappeared. And they have a need to feel their values are rooted in something larger and more fundamental than themselves, that there's a source of good and evil, not just personal preference. And right now, I don't think there's a substitute for the great faiths in meeting those needs, at least in the United States. Whether there can be in 30 or 50 or 100 years, maybe there can. And of course, if Christianity is dying anyway, then I've got to very much hope there can be a substitute.
Yeah.
And I just don't know yet if the faith can be saved. I think if it keeps doing what it's doing, it probably won't. But there are signs of renewal. There are a lot of Christians who are unhappy with the way things are going in the MAGA church and all of that, and working on renewal. And Christians like Russell Moore, who's a editor of Christianity Today and a man of great integrity and deep faith, says it won't be like some schism, some mighty battle between the MAGA church and the anti-MAGA church, that what it is with Christianity throughout history is renewal from the grassroots. The planting of new churches, the coming of a new generation. There does seem to be an appetite for religion that's come up in Gen Z. We're starting to see some signs of that. It will be another generation of pastors, that it will be in the small groups, which are how the evangelical churches do a lot of their acculturation, the Bible studies, for example. And that's where it will come from if it comes.
Look, if there's a way for, I'm not stridently anti-religious in the sense that if there's a way for us to give voice to the mystery and unfathomability of the human condition, of the nature of consciousness, of the scale of the cosmos, in ways that are not doctrinaire about their cosmological and historical claims, then go for it. I'd much prefer that to a world of rival superstitions, a demon-haunted world, as Carl Sagan wrote a brilliant book about. If it's off the table that we're all going to become enlightened, Richard Feynman's and, create a pluralistic secular democracy, if people are going to crave a context for the mysteries of meaning, then I'm happy for those things to be religions in the same way. I mean, as long as they're religions of the sort that my rabbi who bar mitzvahed me, who I saw for the first time in more than 20 years the other day, he is the most secular, spiritual guy you've ever met in your life. I mean, and if everyone can be like that, and there are new churches, new versions of Christianity that spring up like that, then let's just say I'll take that as a long-term solution over the chaos of ad hoc superstition. Yeah.
Would you? So I guess the proposition I'm making is to ask for a bit more than that from Christians, and to say that Christianity in particular, which is who my book is addressed to, it's called Christianity's Broken Bargain Democracy. It's not about religion generally. In the United States, at least, Judaism and the Catholic Church and the Black Church are not the problem. They are not causing the crisis in our democracy right now. The nub of the problem is white evangelical Protestants, who are numerically the largest and have become most closely aligned with politicization. And so I want to go one step further than you do and say Christianity has actual content that distinguishes it from other religions, and that, if believed in and practiced by Christians, would strengthen our country and strengthen our liberal democracy. So please, Christians, do that. I want to say more than just sort of broadly, well, it's good if people believe something. I want to say, Christians, do what it says in your scripture.
Since I've made a habit, John, throughout this interview of answering for you by quoting your words, I'm going to end the interview with the same habit, which is, this is the thing that really stuck with me, this line. My claim, you write, is not just that secular liberalism and religious faith are instrumentally interdependent, but that each is intrinsically reliant on the other to build a morally complete and coherent account of the world. I'll have to sleep on that for my 6 months to figure out what I think of it in the global sense, but in the American sense, I think that is true. John, from your lips to God's ears, as they say, thank you for explaining it to us. It's great to see you again.
Thanks for having me, Josh. It's always a pleasure.